Hi, my name is Warren Ertl. I'm a composer in Boston, and I'm also the founder and band leader of the Greenlight Jazz Orchestra. Today I'm going to talk to you about one of America's most beloved and celebrated composers, George Gershwin. Gershwin was born in 1898 to Russian Jewish immigrants in Brooklyn, New York. He had an older brother who would become his lifelong collaborator named Ira, and started out his life with no interest in music, really just a normal kid causing trouble on the streets and roller skating, things that you expect children to do. But the parents of the Gershwin boys had a piano delivered to the house, initially for Ira to take lessons on, but to their surprise, it was actually George who took a shine to the instrument faster. And turns out this was a relief for Ira because he didn't really want to play piano that much. He wanted to write, which good thing he made that choice, or none of the Gershwin songs would have lyrics. So George starts studying as a concert pianist and training with piano teachers. He also starts taking composition from a couple of different teachers, most notably Henry Cowell. Cowell was an experimental composer in the early 20th century. He'd be very interested in tuning systems, and he liked making new instruments, homemade instruments that were different from the ones that were used in the Western classical tradition. As he grew up, he took a couple of jobs as a young man. The first of these was as a song plugger on Tin Pan Alley. Now, we've heard this thrown around a lot, a song plugger. Oh yes, many notable musicians at the time were song pluggers, but what did that really mean? Basically, if you imagine an office building where there are offices all around the perimeter, there would be these rooms like that, and each of them would have a piano in there, and there would be these song pluggers who would be brought the scores to new songs, or what the composers of those songs hoped would be the next big hit, and it was their job to play these tunes for audiences who would come by and see what was going to be next on the charts, or what they wanted to purchase and publish and whatever. So he was apparently one of the best. We have it written, a couple accounts of clients that would come by and say, if you really want to hear the song played like it's going to sound, and for it to be very accurate and full of energy, go to George Gershwin's room. He'll play it right. Gershwin during that time was being exposed to all manners of pop music, and the popular music at the time was jazz, which was growing at a very rapid rate. He was also a piano roll maker. That was his second job. He worked for the Aeolian Company in New York City, making piano rolls, which a lot of you might have heard of a player piano before, but basically it was this piano that was a form of entertainment for the homes, because if you didn't have a Victrola, which were the new record players coming out, then you might have a player piano to play music even if no one in your house was musically able. So the maker of these rolls, they were take a wax cylinder that rolled out into what looks like paper, and they would notch it, and this would align with the mechanism in the inside that would play the music. So it's almost like, it almost looks like Braille on a sign outside of a classroom or something. So it was just a different way of, you can think of it as a different way of making a score. During that time, he met another piano roll maker in the same job, which was James P. Johnson, who was an African-American composer and pianist and was well known at the time in the early 20s. His most popular tune is probably the Charleston, which sounds a lot like this. became decently good friends, and that's another way Gershwin is exposed to the popular music at the time. So he started accompanying vaudeville singers and started being involved as an accompanist in the theater circles. And he wrote a song in the late teens called Swanee, and he wrote it in collaboration with lyricist Irving Caesar. And Swanee sounds like this. Goes on this way. And just by chance, Al Jolson, who was a popular vaudeville performer at the time, heard Gershwin play this song at a party and was interested in including it in one of his vaudeville routines. And this gave George Gershwin his first national hit. He would collaborate on a few other songs with Caesar, but ultimately, for the rest of his short life, he would collaborate with his brother Ira on songs. Now, he wrote many songs and musicals with his brother Ira, because after his hits initially happened in the vaudeville circuit, he began collaborating with other composers and accompanists on musical theater scores, and ultimately started writing his own. Musicals were a little different at the time. Today, all of the music is written to serve the plot. But at the time, composers like George Gershwin and Cole Porter, they were writing songs first, and they would just interchangeably use these songs in different shows. So what we get from composers like Porter and Gershwin more than anything are what we treasure in America as our jazz standards. Songs that are still played today in movies and sung by singers in different locations and venues, which is probably how a lot of us still know George Gershwin's music. But there were a couple of musicals that George and Ira wrote that were cohesive. When he was in Paris, he wrote a musical called An American in Paris, which is a well-known one of his. He also wrote an opera called Porgy and Bess, which some of you may be familiar with. It spawned a lot of his great standards, such as Summertime. He wrote Of Thee I Sing, and that one is sort of a cornerstone for musical theater because that was the first Pulitzer Prize winning musical. It won Ira the award for Best Drama. So we've covered Gershwin growing up and how he's influenced by jazz and how he's contributing or starting to contribute to the American sound. And we've gotten through his musicals, which I don't want to touch too heavily on. I want to kind of focus around his style and his classical writing. Now, jazz at the time, you must understand, was not viewed the way we view it today. It's kind of the great American pastime of music now, much way baseball is for sports. But at the time, there was a lot of reluctancy towards jazz because there were other musics out there. The waltz was still prominent, opera, symphony orchestras, classical music. A lot of your middle-aged to older folks would be more of a fan of that, and jazz was thought as almost like a second-rate music to be played in the clubs, and once Prohibition started, in the speakeasies and all of these other theaters and places, but it wasn't viewed as the same class as classical music at first. There was a prominent band leader in the 1920s named Paul Whiteman, and Paul Whiteman led a large jazz orchestra, and he was even nicknamed the King of Jazz. Whether he was or not, no one can really say. There were a lot of great players out there, but he was, for a fact, given the nickname the King of Jazz. He had a popular recording of John Schoenberger's song Whispering in 1920. That song sounds a lot like... Now, this very song, George Gershwin himself made a piano roll of while he worked at the Aeolian Company. It was a very popular tune, and Paul Whiteman had the most famous recording of it. Now, Whiteman, being a classically trained violinist himself, but also a lover and a performer of jazz music, thought that jazz could be more than what people gave it credit for. He was very interested and instrumental in creating a genre called symphonic jazz. Now, this started with a concert that he wanted to have in an effort to bring this to light. And in 1924, to participate on this concert, Paul Whiteman commissioned George Gershwin to write a piece for his orchestra that was to be a piano concerto-esque piece and would feature George himself on the piano at the premiere. Now, this piece would become titled Rhapsody in Blue and is one of George Gershwin's most beloved works. It opens with wailing in the clarinet. Right? And it continues. Now, that type of glissando figure would be heard in the jazz clubs by clarinetists because clarinet was a prominent instrument in Dixieland jazz and in early jazz. So Gershwin was taking elements that he had heard and was familiar with from the styles of jazz and throwing them right into this classical piece, which is precisely what Paul Whiteman wanted to do. And, we get this very energetic piece. The piano enters. So we get figures like that are very classically pianistic, but are also using jazz harmonies. Those types of stackings are something we're going to hear a lot in Gershwin's music. And quintessential, at least to my personal ear, one thing that I relate to Gershwin very closely is this type of stacking that happens in the low instruments leading up to the trumpet entrance of the main theme. And the trumpet continues, but this stacking the fifth on the bottom and then the third and the seventh on top is something Gershwin's going to use in a lot of his music. You can hear it across the board. It even shows up in other instruments. It even shows up in other composers, rather, such as Duke Ellington, who is a rising jazz star at the time. He has this tune that was his signature when his orchestra opened at the Cotton Club called Jubilee Stomp. And it sounds, the main theme is... continues like that. But when Duke Ellington enters for his solo, he has a very similar Gershwin-esque stacking, and these playing all the way down in his solo intros. So like that, that type of voicing is going to be present in jazz for the next 100 years, even today. So this piece is a great success for Gershwin, and he's later going to continue on after this concert, really establishes Gershwin as a composer of serious music, and not only a song plugger, not only a composer of theater music, not only a songwriter, but a symphonic composer. He's going to write a piano concerto in F, and then he's going to write a second Rhapsody, because after the 1920s, the height of his musical writing, he still continues, but as it gets into the 1930s, George Gershwin is actually going to move out to Los Angeles to do some early film score work. And he has a bunch of bits and pieces of music that weren't used in the film score. So George took that and compiled it together and reworked it into a new orchestral piece called Second Rhapsody. And that is written in about 1931. So, that's a little of George Gershwin's biography. Now, how did jazz have an influence on Gershwin, and what can we take away from his style? Well, one thing that's characteristics of his songs, at least form and analysis-wise, is at the beginning, first of all, he wasn't the only person to do this. Cole Porter did this from time to time, and other composers did too, but something that's present in almost every Gershwin song is a slow intro. Now, this slow intro is going to develop out of what we call recitative in the opera world, which is, a chord, and there's some singing out of rhythm. It happens again. And, the singer is doing all types of embellishments over this, and then we get into the aria proper. So Gershwin's going to take the same idea, and you can think of this, and if you know someone to watch over me, the beginning starts slow with these sustained chords, and you have "There's a saying old, says that love is blind, still we're often told, seek and ye shall find," and it continues that way before we get into the song as we know it, or the song proper. Now, stride piano is something I want to end with talking here, and is a big part of Gershwin's style, but he by no means came up with it. Early 1900s America, we're in the Gilded Age, the Industrial Revolution is really taken off, cars are being made, Henry Ford, Vanderbilt, oil and steel, and Carnegie, names you've heard before, tycoons at the time. What's going on in music? Well, there's classical music, but developing out of places such as Harlem, there is ragtime. And a prominent composer, perhaps the most prominent composer of this, and one of my favorites, very respected American composer, is Scott Joplin. And ragtime is a lot slower. People think of it as, the stride being super fast in the left hand, but in probably 90% of Scott Joplin's scores, he says, not too fast. He stresses that. And he's quoted as saying, don't play this song too fast. It's never right to play ragtime fast. So, ragtime's a little bit different. Take his Pineapple Rag, for instance. I'll play a little of it for you now. see it's nice and easy. The stride in the left hand is simple more times than not. It's just bass, chord, bass, chord. But every now and then we have little leading tones in there. Well, this is going to get really exaggerated as it gets into the 1920s. You have pianists such as Jelly Roll Morton developing in New Orleans, Louisiana, coming up about the same time as Gershwin, but in the South, and he's going to migrate all over touring with his orchestra. But Jelly Roll is going to be a big fan of trying to emulate all the voices of the band in his playing, so you know, he'll speed it up and we'll get things like and on like that, and then inner voices. So this thread of stride bass that started from ragtime is now being developed further and further and embellished. Now it's not just bass chord anymore, it has we have inner voices happening here and just other embellishments going on. And some of his piano roll music, Gershwin is going to really exaggerate this. He has a roll of a tune of his called That Certain Feeling, and I'll sort of end with some of that, but you'll notice in the middle section it'll sound like this. So you hear this descending line that moves the whole time there. That'll be something that's characteristic of a lot of people, but Gershwin in particular. So thanks for listening with me today. I hope you learned something, and enjoy a little bit of That Certain Feeling to take us out.